Thanks, Carolyn and Tony, for the invitation to be the interlocutor for this session. As is customary, I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which I am beaming in to you from today, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the East Kulin Nation. I want to acknowledge the important role that story has played on these lands for thousands of years. And I feel privileged to work alongside artists that are continuing that storytelling practice of one of the oldest surviving cultures in the world. I want to pay respects to all First Peoples, elders, past, present, and emerging. And I want to acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded and a treaty has not been signed. And in a minute, Brydie, if it's okay, I'll turn it over to you in case you wanted to do your own acknowledgement. But I thought I'd just give you a little introduction first, if that's okay. So Professor Brydie-Leigh Bartleet is an Australian Research Council Future Fellow, which is a very high honor in this country, at the Creative Arts Research Institute and Queensland Conservatorium at Griffith University in Australia. She is a superstar researcher, teacher, and arts sector advocate. Her work is dedicated to helping the world see and experience the benefits of music and the arts in First Nations communities, in prisons, in war-affected cities, in educational and industry contexts, to name a few. And that research connects music and music research with efforts to address social inequality, regional development, criminology and corrections, health, equity, and human rights. She's won national and international competitive grants, fellowships, research consultancies with arts and social sector organizations totaling well over 3 million. And we know, I hope we all know here in this Zoom, Bridie's work as an autoethnographer, which teaches us both how autoethnography has helped musicians reflect on their creative work in culturally insightful and sensitive ways, and also how music expands the creative possibilities of autoethnography. In 2009, Bridie and Carolyn Ellis co-edited the wonderful collection Music Autoethnographies, Making Autoethnography Sing, Making Music Personal. And Bridie also wrote the foundational chapter on artistic autoethnography, which charts the intersections of autoethnography and artistic research for the second edition of the Handbook of Autoethnography, and a chapter that draws together artful and embodied methods, modes of inquiry, and forms of representation for our first edition of the handbook. And Bridie, it's just such a pleasure to be able to be here and talk with you today. So before we dive into the questions, I'll open the floor to you for whatever acknowledgements and welcomes you'd like to make.
Thank you so much, Stacy, and it's such a pleasure and an honor to share this space with you and with everybody who's joining us. Thank you for that embarrassing introduction. Had I known you were going to say that, I would have said stop. And just acknowledging those who are joining us in the room. For our friends in the US, it's the end of the day. I know you probably have grumbly tummies and you want to get to your dinner. So thank you for hanging on at the end of the day. And if there's any Aussies on the line, it's 9 a.m. for me Sunday morning. So that's dedication, or 10 o'clock if you're somewhere else. So just acknowledging all of your presence. It's lovely to be in the room with all of you. I'm coming to you from Meanjin, which is otherwise known as Brisbane, and I'm at home because it's Sunday morning and we live on the lands of the Jagera and Turrbal people. And Sally, I see it's 11 p.m. for you, so thank you for being here at that time. I acknowledge the Jagera and Turrbal peoples who are the traditional custodians of the lands upon which we live. I'll paint a picture for you. We live at the foothills of Mount Cootha, which is a very, very beautiful mountain filled with lots of native birds. And this is a really important, significant cultural place for bees, for native bees. There's a special bee dreaming here. So it's a really important gathering place that we live on. So I acknowledge that. And I also acknowledge the many elders and traditional custodians who've been my teachers and mentors, my First Nations students and collaborators, and any First Nations colleagues who we might have on the line with us today.
Thanks so much, Bridie. So I was hoping that we could start with your story of discovering autoethnography and just how you and Carolyn came to co-edit the book on music autoethnographies. I have my own perception of that when Carolyn came back and told us all about it, but I want to hear your version of the story.
Thanks, Stacy. And I want to give a special shout out to Carolyn, who I consider a dear friend and a great inspiration in my life. We haven't seen each other in a long time, yet I feel just as connected to you now as I did, 15 years ago when we were working on the book. So a huge shout out and thank you to you and to Tony and to Keith and Art for the invitation to be here. So look, meeting Carolyn was just one of those pivotal moments in my life. I bet you everyone who's met Carolyn would say the same. It was such a deeply enriching and inspiring moment where all the thinking and exploring and work that we'd been doing finally was sort of validated, and Carolyn came and just really inspired us and gave us the guts to keep doing what we were doing. And it really led to so much flourishing in this field and area after her visit. So I really want to acknowledge that. There's a backstory. There's always a backstory to how these things come about. And so it goes back to around 2005, and I just finished my doctorate. And my doctorate was an ethnography exploring the lives of conductors who identify as women. And so I'd been asked to go and give classes on ethnography to a group of students at the Conservatorium where I work who were in a new program called the Doctor of Musical Arts. And these were students who are leading musicians who were coming back to study and do their doctorates to really try and understand their practice in deeper ways. So I was giving my classes in ethnography and talking about the really relational nature of this particular approach, and it really being a story about others, but of course the self is very implicated in that. And the students immediately latched onto that relational way of working, and they said, you're talking a lot about others in relation to self. What about self in relation to others? And I said, well, that would be autoethnography. And they just didn't let it go. They kept asking me more and more. And there was this thirst and appetite from these musicians who were wanting to find ways to really validate and explore their own personal relations and experiences in terms of a bigger context and picture. So I thought, there's no way I can teach this if I don't go and do it myself. Otherwise, I'm just fudging it. And so I sort of launched into autoethnographic explorations of my own conducting practice, just to play with it, to experiment, to get in the sandpit of it. And of course, immediately started reading and exploring lots and came across Carolyn's work, came across your work, Stacy, all of your kaleidoscope notes and Art's work. And just, I can remember the day I was sitting on the couch. I did have the ethnographic eye in my hand, and I was like, this is it. This is what we're really looking for in terms of us finding ways for these amazing musicians to be able to explore their experiences in ways that validate who they are. And so, long story short, I was like, we need to get Carolyn here. We need her energy. We need her inspiration. And so we did lots of work. We did some earlier workshops, and then we invited Carolyn over, and we worked on a book at the same time as doing the workshop so that people could take something away from the workshop and have something to read and explore following all of the presentations that we'd shared in person. So Carolyn came with this amazing bundle of energy. She gave a lecture. We did these workshops where everybody shared their autoethnographic work, and we also launched the book. And that was 15 years ago now. So that's where it kind of all started. And it's a really happy memory and happy time. And I hope that kind of energy comes out in the book, even though it's getting a little old now. 15 years. I think that energy and vitality and kind of excitement of meetings really came across in our introduction.
That's great. That's great. It is a lovely book. I really recommend it to everybody on the screen. I will pop a link into the chat in a minute. But gee, when you say that, Bridie, and I think, Oh yeah, might be time for a second edition of the music autoethnographies. I think there's a lot of autoethnographers who might want to contribute a chapter. Just saying, just saying.
Could I jump in for just a moment? Yeah,
Of
'cause
course.
I mean, what wonderful memories. I'm just thrilled to think about that time and how important all that was to my life too, to be working with you in this way and working with music students and bringing music and autoethnography together. I mean, it was a huge part of what was going on for us at the time and how the autoethnography was expanding. And Bridie, I have to tell you, was the most wonderful person to work with. Just we worked back and forth on these chapters, and I couldn't have had a better partner. And I was just in heaven doing all this work. And then to go there and meet all these people and hear about their projects, just heaven. So thank you, and thank you for the memories.
Yeah,
Oh, thank you, Carolyn. That's
that's
beautiful.
great.
Yeah.
That's
But
wonderful.
Carolyn makes a really interesting point in terms of the development of the fields, because there was something that was sparking in both the field of autoethnography as it was expanding, and then in the sort of conservatoire setting where we were really pushing the artistic research agenda, that was still kind of new and expanding. And so these two fields were kind of really developing in parallel. So there was something really exciting about the interplay and the weaving that was happening at that particular moment in time that I think really helped both grow a lot.
Yeah. Well, let's dive in a little bit there, Bridie. What do you think? I'm curious about how that work. What you maybe you've spoken a little bit about what autoethnography brings to artistic research and music in particular. And I'm curious too, what you think the artistic research in music in particular offers to autoethnography. So could you talk a little bit about that kind of interplay and the contributions that each makes to the other?
Sure. Well, I think both have a lot in common in terms of the sorts of desires and questions that we're asking, the lines of inquiry that we're following, the ways in which we're doing it, and how we're trying to communicate in ways that are really evocative and emotive and aesthetically, you know, interesting. And so there's a lot in common. And I think both have a lot to give to one another. If I kind of reflect back on the book we were just talking about a moment ago, the subtitle is quite an interesting one. We said, making autoethnography sing and making music personal. And I still stand by that, but I've kind of thought about it in retrospect and gone, making autoethnography sing. If I think about all of the autoethnography that I was reading, it was very lyrical. It was very rhythmic. It did have a particular timbre and tone, and it was kind of singing off the page. And then if I think about music, and some of my colleagues kind of looked at me and went, making music personal? All music's personal, you know. This is the most ancient and ubiquitous form of personal expression we have available to us. You know, what are you on about? But I think what we were trying to do was we were trying to find places for that singing and that personal in the academy, because it didn't have a home where it was fully accepted to be who it was and be itself and be accepted at that particular point in time. So I think what we were really trying to do was find that home, that language, that apparatus, and that acceptance within the academy. And I think in terms of making autoethnography sing, I think the sort of musical processes of exploration, of experimentation, of improvisation, of exploring on deeply emotional levels that can communicate and resonate with people in ways that make them think about their own lives. I think that's what music and artistic research methods bring to autoethnography. And then, of course, I think in terms of the personal, autoethnography has also just given musicians a sense of validation that their personal experiences do matter and do count, but also ways of thinking about that ethno part. putting their own personal experiences within a much broader, not only musical context, which they're really good at doing, but that broader social and cultural context, and pushing them to go beyond the navel gazing, which working in a conservatoire with a lot of musicians, I can tell you, does happen. And so I think they've both pushed each other in really helpful ways. But as I've written more recently, I don't think all autoethnography is necessarily musical, nor do I think all artistic research in music is necessarily autoethnography. I've been really interested in a sort of interface where sometimes they do intersect, but it's not all the time. And that came from a reaction when I just noticed all of our students started doing autoethnography. Literally, Carolyn, after your visit, everyone was doing autoethnography. It was like this crazy phase. And I was like, there needs to be some critical thinking here, rather than just adoption without thinking. And so I'm really interested in that interface now where they can enrich one another.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Brydie. Thanks. I don't know. I feel I'm going to ask this because I think it's part of, it's so integral to what you're saying. And I don't know, just moving to Australia, it was a new term for me, but can you just talk a little bit about artistic research and the intersections of autoethnography that you see there? I think this has something to do with what you've just said about that kind of critical purchase that people have on their own practice and their own ways of working, but it might be helpful for those on the screen who might not be familiar with that term.
Sure. So artistic research, I guess, is an approach to research where you ask artistic questions using artistic means and you answer them through artistic channels and platforms. So I work in a conservatorium environment with a lot of musicians who are asking interesting and critical questions about their own creative practice, but they don't then go and do a bunch of interviews and surveys about it. They actually explore those questions in that line of inquiry through their creative practice. And then they don't go and write 80,000 words about it. They share a portfolio of musical works that provide the answer to the questions through artistic means. And so artistic research has kind of had a similar trajectory to autoethnography in terms of how long it's been around. And it's a term we use here in Australia. It's a term often used in Europe. In the US, slightly different terminology is being used, and we don't need to go into that, but you might be used to creative practice research or practice-led research, which is a bit different to practice-based research. But basically, the creative practice is at the heart of it. And so as you can imagine, autoethnography's focus on understanding the self in relation to a broader social and cultural context fits really well with these creative researchers looking at their own work. So
thanks, Brydie.
Explains it. From my view anyway, my limited understanding. There are others on the call who could give much more eloquent examples, I'm sure.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and bring things up to 2022 when you were in New York and you were doing a collaboration with NYU Steinhardt. You were on a Fulbright fellowship there. So your aim was to work with musicians and organizations in New York who were using music to tackle social inequities. And I'm wondering how, if it did, autoethnography figured in that project, both in your personal life. I certainly was I followed very closely the journey of your family whilst living in New York. So I feel like I got a Facebook autoethnography in terms of that experience. But how that might have figured into your personal life and your scholarly life and any writing that's come out of that work.
Sure. Well, I mean, autoethnography always infiltrates. Hey, once you've sort of been bitten by it, it's kind of tattooed on you. And whether you're trying to do it explicitly or not, you just can't help yourself. So it came out in Facebook. It kind of came out in all sorts of different ways. So just to explain, I was awarded a Fulbright in 2020, which, if you can remember what happened in 2020, it was a great year to be awarded a Fulbright when the whole world grounded. And so I only got to go in 2022 and was hosted by the amazing Barbara Hesse at NYU, who has done a huge amount of work advocating for the role of music in social development at the UN. And so we were going there to work on a special compendium to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the UN and to make a case for the important role that music's playing across the world in addressing a wide range of things, in particular social inequity. And so we compiled this amazing compendium of over 100 programs, and we were supposed to do this in person, and we were supposed to launch it at the UN. Instead, we got to do it online. So all of us have those sort of stories of regret when our live streams got dashed, but it was still an amazing opportunity to work with Barbara and to also get a global picture of the way in which music is operating across 54 different countries in really deep and profound ways. So we still got to do work together, and I still got to travel around New York, meeting some of the organizations and trying to understand the ways in which they worked. But autoethnography, I guess, became part of my processing of what I was experiencing. I was really trying to be open in all senses to what was happening. I was not so much focused on information gathering, but relationship building and connection building. And autoethnography was kind of helping to really open my senses and open my thinking. And so I did a lot of journaling. And when I came back, I was asked to present on it. And I actually decided it was time to do an autoethnographic presentation, because I hadn't done one in quite some time. And so I framed it around ways of knowing, being, and doing, which, having worked with First Nations communities for a very long time, sat really well. And I started to explore things that were being triggered in me from being in New York around stories of migration, stories of poverty and homelessness, stories of incarceration, and the ways in which the arts can help make space for us to be ourselves. And these were stories that relate to parts of my story, stories that relate to the research that I've been doing for the past 20 years. And so I can put the link in the chat if you wanted to watch the sort of presentation where I share this in a really personal way and craft these autoethnographies around ways of knowing, being, and doing, exploring these kind of really deep issues from the experiences I was having, from going to exhibitions, to meeting people, to being triggered in all sorts of interesting ways, also where we were living, where issues of proximity are so acute in terms of social inequity, and why nobody's doing anything about it, and just sitting with it, and how the arts can help us move to more dialogic spaces where we're not just passing each other like strangers. So that was all going on at the same time as meeting and doing all of this research.
Wow. Thanks, Brydie, for that. It would just be so wonderful to have a look too at those videos. So thank you for that. Thank you for that. I want to make some space too for you to talk about your current long-term project, your future fellowship project, and again, the autoethnographic intersection. So this is focusing in particular on community music and still thinking very deeply about social inequities. So would you like to talk a little bit about that work that you're doing? I think that's finishing up maybe next year. I can't remember how long that project's running. And just where narrative and autoethnography are finding their way into that work as well.
Thanks, Stacy. Like I said, it always finds its way, whether we like it or not. And so, just to explain for our friends in the room, this future fellowship ends, yes, at the middle of next year. It's called the Creative Change Project. If you look up the Creative Change Project online, you'll be able to find us there. And we're trying to explore the role that community music made in communities, can play in addressing entrenched social inequity in Australian communities. And the way these future fellowships work is they're usually given to an individual, not always, but an individual who then sort of works a bit like a lone wolf and goes and does this amazing project. But with a topic like this, I have lived experience, my family have lived experience of it, but that's one person and one family. And so I've rather used the funds to bring together a team of researchers who bring to the topic really diverse lived experience of inequity in many, many different forms. So there's 6 of us all coming with diverse life experiences. They're all creative, so they have incredibly different creative skill sets. And we're collaboratively working together to try and understand this topic. So the fact that I've even chosen this team and we're working together in this way signals to you that we're really placing a strong emphasis on also coming to the topic through our own lived experiences, understanding what's drawn us to this particular work. But then we're also working with a wide range of communities, from very remote communities in Western Australia in the Pilbara to outback Queensland, down to your town of Naarm in Melbourne, Stacy, and other parts close by to us as well. To be honest, I'm still working through how I share my personal story in relation to this topic, because it starts to get to the heart of some of the really tricky, thorny ethical questions relating to family and lived experience. And I was drawn to working on this particular topic from the last 15 years of working in Central Australia, where I really experienced the situation. It's a very strong First Nations community that I've worked with for a long time, where there's enormous cultural strength, but incredible social challenges. And I was really trying to understand why people were not drawing on the cultural strengths to address the social challenges. And so that's kind of been an impetus for me looking at this. But there's also my own life experiences and lived experience. And this really came to the fore in New York as well, around inequity and disadvantage, around mental health, around substance abuse, a large range of stories and experiences that are all informing how I'm looking at this topic and how I'm trying to understand the ways in which music might create spaces and places for people to be themselves and be accepted, which we really understand to be at the heart of social equity. And so, my team and I are doing lots of writing now and doing lots of narrative, and we'll get to this probably in a moment if you ask me what I'm working on next, where I'm trying to find ways of sharing this story in ways that don't hurt people who are close to me, where these issues are not past, but they're still very much alive and well in their lives. So that's a part of the project I don't normally talk about, because I'm not talking normally to friends who are autoethnographers. It's normally an emphasis on the issues and the sectors who aren't working together well enough and this and that. So it's nice to have a moment to kind of reflect on that personal underbelly, which is absolutely at the heart of what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Bridie. I mean, I really appreciate you diving in there. I know you're in the midst of that work. And so, I think this is a good example of, we don't always know and have it all figured out, but it is really important to underline that really deeply personal element to all of the work that we do. This wasn't on the list of questions. Oh, do you want to say something else, Bridie?
I just wanted to also, sort of looping back to our earlier conversation about musicians, I think what's really interesting in this project is the team who I'm working with are phenomenal musicians, and they are making sense and processing their own life experiences that I'm talking about through musical means. So we've got songwriters who are processing what they're experiencing. They're putting those into songs. We've got others who are doing soundscapes with what they're listening to in the country that they're exploring and using that to process and make sense. And so it's been really interesting to see how, that they're using those creative means, like we talked about before, in ways that might stretch the creative possibilities of autoethnography. I wanted to acknowledge them.
Yeah. And I think it gets to what's coming up for me that I'd like to get your take on, which loops back to what you were saying about the relational. And I'm thinking about two things. I'm thinking about what the example you just gave about song, and about how song helps pull in natural sounds and relationships with environment and place, as well as working with First Nations communities, and just a different understanding of what the auto and autoethnography might mean, in terms of not a kind of individual. It also goes back to what you were saying about the Future Fellowship and how you've approached that, not an individual, singular, sort of self-contained notion of self. So what's your take on the bit of autoethnography in this work that you're doing?
Stacy, you just blew my mind. You've just made me realize. Yeah, I mean, I say this funny thing. I feel like I've almost, because I've been working with First Nations communities for so long, my mentors, teachers have all been First Nations elders. I say to my First Nations collaborators, I feel like I'm a foster kid of First Nations culture, because I will this is not my culture and it never will be, but so much of that thinking has really seeped in so deep. And so that collective I think, like you've just identified, I immediately went there without even realizing it. So thank you for pointing that out to me. That has very much been, I think, part of how I've been operating and being taught and schooled over the last 15 or so years since we've been working there. And we currently have an amazing project we're working on called the Remedy Project. And this is a First Nations led project, First Nations governed project. I'm one of the few non-Indigenous researchers on it, looking at the role of music as a cultural determinant of health for First Nations communities. And it's all, of course, when we talk about the I, it's never an individual, it's a collective. And when we talk about music, of course, in many First Nations cultures in Australia, there is not a word for music. It's not a singular thing. You have song, which is connected to country, which is a very complex concept, which is connected to your ancestors, which is connected to the community and family who you're with, which is connected to songs and stories and knowledge. And so this web of interconnected ways of thinking about things makes it a really interesting eye when we're talking about the autoethnographic eye, the ethnographic eye. And so I think that's really that relational way of thinking about how things are never an isolated entity, but they all influence one another in interesting dynamic ways, but also when we get to the relational and really reciprocal ways that bring responsibilities, that bring obligations, that bring ways of knowing, being and doing that you need to follow to work in appropriate ways. So that has really taught me a lot about these sort of relational ways of working, which of course autoethnography is. It's all about the relational.
Yeah. That's beautiful. Thank you, Brydie. It's so nice to hear you speak so beautifully about that. So and you're a good sport responding to the question that wasn't on the list. Thank you very much. Okay, well, you've mentioned this a little bit, and I love how Carolyn puts this. So what's next for you, or what burns in your soul to do in the future? What's the next project you want to take on?
Well, there are projects which are burning, and or these sort of inklings that just won't go away that keep niggling. And I have a real interest in, my background was in gender studies, and kind of bringing that back into the frame with this equity work that I've been doing around particular complex social issues. So there's projects. But what I'm working on at the moment is a book. I feel like I need to whisper it because it's at that stage where it's like, don't ask me anymore, because it's still coming into formation, but it is burning. And it's a book that's trying to speak about the last 20 years of work around how music changes people's lives. And I've been trying to think about ways to write beyond an academic audience. I've been writing for an academic audience. I've become really comfortable in that way of writing, and that's great. But I'm like, that's too small. You need to be thinking about how you can communicate this more broadly. And so I've been struggling with all different ways of approaching it. And I'm now moving towards memoir, and I'm actually doing a memoir boot camp, which I'm supposed to be at this morning, but I've told them I had to come and spend my morning with you rather. And it's just been a way of unlocking all sorts of things, and also kind of working through some of the ethics I was having trouble with around storytelling and whose stories I can tell or shouldn't tell. And by approaching it in this way, I'm kind of being able to work through some of those ethical quandaries that I'm having. But the whole process of understanding memoir as a genre and the challenging way in which it makes you make sense of things, of course, as we know, and people have written about this for a long time, there's so many parallels with autoethnography. So that's what's burning in me, and it's bloody hard work.
Yeah, yeah. And we say a little bit more about this memoir boot camp and what you're up to as part of that. I'm curious.
So we have this beautiful bookstore here in Brisbane called Avid Reader, and they create an amazing community of writers here. It's in West End, and it's they have all sorts of workshops and events that bring together writers of all different types. Some are, people like me, others are journalists, others are, your granny who's 90 years old and she's going to write her memoir because her kids gave her the boot camp voucher for Christmas. And we all come together. There's actually a few of them. I love them. They got the best stories to tell. We're coming together with Christina Olson, who's an award-winning writer and wrote an incredible memoir that won all of these awards. But we're working through a range of different topics and writing at the same time around form and structure, around truth, around finding voice, around trying to find the big story in our story. This is like autoethnography 101. But all of those really interesting sorts of dilemmas and how you weave different time scales together. So those are the sessions we're doing, but we're doing it as a collective. So it's a really lovely gathering of fellow writers who are all coming at it with the most interesting tales. And of course, there's nothing better than when you read a bit of your writing and everyone goes, ooh, it's a bit like the Carolyn's wow. When you get that on your manuscript, that boost keeps you going for a long time.
That's great. That's great. Okay, we'll be on the lookout for this burning work that you're
no
doing.
pressure or anything.
Yeah. I love that you're doing that though, and I just really want to thank you too for talking about that in relation to projects, right? And just how those things can be connected, but also there are these kind of passion efforts, we'll say, that we just need to pursue, and we don't always know how they're going to come together. But it's good to allow yourself some latitude and some space to do that. It just feels like a little bit of a pushback against the kind of neoliberal academic university life, which is, what are your projects and what's their timelines and how are you going to deliver them? And so
totally. And how much money are you bringing in for them? Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
All about the money.
Yeah, it's inspiring to hear you. And you're such a busy, actively engaged person on that end of things. It also should inspire. It inspires me and the rest of us on the screen that we can have it all. Bridie, I just that's what I'm thinking about today when you're talking about that. Or at least, we need to prioritize those kinds of personal, those personally valuable. Yeah.
I'm not sure we can have it all, but I completely agree on the prioritizing, because those creative modes of writing are really very, very different in terms of the energy and the way in which we operate to some of those bigger project public facing things. And so if we don't prioritize, then they're never going to get written.
That's right. Okay. All right. And we don't have to have it all. I'm taking that back. I don't want to, I'm walking that back. I think that's right. That's yeah. Okay. So I want to make some space for questions, but I just want to ask one last question, which is Bridie, what's your best advice for researchers who are new to autoethnography? What are the kind of key pieces of advice you like to give folks?
I think read, listen, view. You know, you really need to, you know, autoethnography is a genre. There's such a huge body of work there that I think can be incredibly creatively inspiring if people immerse themselves in it, eat it, you know, digest it, come to understand form and structure in the many different ways in which people have done it for themselves. And you know, what I get really annoyed at is when, you know, students go, I'm doing an autoethnography, and I'm like, great, whose work have you looked at? Sorry, Carolyn. They say Carolyn Ellis. I said Carolyn Ellis is the greatest. That's awesome, but who else? And they can't mention anyone else. I'm like, come on, you've got to be going, and you know, Carolyn's work is amazing, but you've got to also look at the breadth of work out there. And so, you know, you've got to do that. But then at the same time, that's everybody else's work in their own voices and their own life experiences. And so I guess it's also a matter of finding space to carve out your own creative voice and get to know your own tone and tenor and way of singing, so that it's true to you what you end up sharing, and it's not a regurgitation of what you've heard and read or listened to from others. So there's that balance of understanding others as well as finding your own creative voice, and just making space for it, because autoethnography can also take time. And you need that time for that meaning making to happen.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Brydie. That's really good advice. Do you have like a recommended readings that you like to give folks? I'm just always curious about what people's go-to kind of exemplars are.
Well, I'll often say people. So, I mean, Carolyn's there, Art's there, you're there, Dan's there, Tony's there, all of the names, as well as some of the collections. I've got the handbook. I'm always putting the big handbook into people's hands to say, look at the breadth of writing here. But I also, you know, on this memoir trip as well, reading some amazing books that are, I think, really helpful in terms of thinking about form and tone. And over the break, I read Suleika Joad's Between Two Kingdoms, which is, I was really taken with the documentary done by her and her partner, John Baptiste, called American Symphony, which was released over the holiday break. And it's a really interesting tale, and she has a cancer memoir there, but she does it in a really interesting way of bringing in stories and insights from others as well. And there's so much, I think, that autoethnographers could learn from reading a book like hers. And so, gosh, I've got so many others I could probably pull from my desk right now, but those are just some that come to mind.
Thanks for that recommendation. And I see Sally's popped something in the chat that looks really good. Thank you, Sally, for that. Looks great. We've got a few minutes.
Sally.
Oh, Sally, go ahead. Talk about that if you want to.
Not my book.
Yeah.
Just when you were talking, Brydie, about memoir, this book, which I still haven't got through, only because busy. It's called Remaking Memory, Autoethnography, Memoir and the Ethics of Self. John Freeman. It's a lovely book. He's in Western Australia.
Oh, great.
Okay, there you go. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
We'll definitely look that up.
Part of it reads really nicely.
And Sally, I saw you had a question in the chat around Indigenous methods and methodologies. Sorry, Stacy, did you want me to? I'll just keep.
Nope,
quiet.
I was you read my mind. You go right ahead. Yeah.
So Sally, the project I mentioned a moment ago called the Remedy Project, which is the First Nations led project led by my dear colleague and sister Naomi Sunderland, who I've worked with for a very long time. We are very much using Indigenous methods there. And one of the key methods and approaches we're using is yarning. So yarning, gosh, if you look up, there are some really great articles which probably speak in more culturally appropriate ways about yarning as a research method that you could look up if you're interested. But for the rest of you, it's a way of talking and conversing in First Nations communities in very non-hierarchical ways. It's quite different to your formal kind of interview. Context, relationship really matter in terms of how we work and approach the conversation. And there's certain forms and structures and ways of approaching yarning that you can read about in these articles, which talk about it as a research method. And we've found that this is a really culturally sensitive way of working and exploring. And sometimes song gets interspersed, sometimes life gets interspersed. Usually lots of food is involved in the process. Context really matters where it happens. And so that's been a really powerful way. And we've actually just written a chapter that'll be coming out in some SAGE methods on decolonizing methods, all about how we've approached this particular method. And always done, of course, with leadership of First Nations community members who are often there helping guide the process as we work. So that's a short answer to what could be a very long answer.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks. That's a great question. Do other folks have questions or points of conversation with Brydie? Carolyn.
So I'm really interested that you're taking these classes in memoir, and I know you whisper the book, so I don't want to ask you too many questions about it, but I'm assuming from that you then plan to write it as a memoir. And I'm curious about that decision, if is your decision, and why not autoethnography? Because the autoethnographers would be very interested in all the questions that you are asking there. And the book will have a very different audience if you publish it as a memoir instead of as an autoethnography. And I also want to put in a plug for our Writing Lives book series.
Carolyn, you're being very sneaky with these suggestions you're making. We're going to walk away and I'm going to change the book, and then we're doing edition 2 of music autoethnography. No, look, these are really great questions, and where do I go? I see so much overlap with memoir and autoethnography anyway, with how I'm approaching it. I'm not a big stickler for the rules. I'm not a big observer of where the boundaries are, and I probably don't pay enough attention as I should to where all of those rules and boundaries sit. And so I suspect that in the end, I'm probably going to, as I often do, carve some little space along the boundary between memoir and autoethnography and some other fields and go, I don't really care what you call it, but these are the questions I'm asking. This is the way I'm asking it, and this is how I want to share my story. I'm so much more interested in trying to make sense of what the big story is in what I'm sharing than I am about what I'm labeling it. So yes, I know there are differences between the two, and I know that when it comes to publishing, they want to label what your genre is. So I'm the annoying one in the class who goes, is there such thing as a hybrid memoir, where it has a bit of this and a bit of that? And they're like, yeah, that's great, but publishers are going to get very confused by what you're doing. So I'm immediately trying to sort of carve a borderland space somewhere between all of them. And when I say hybrid memoir, what I'm wanting to know is how I can bring in the voices and life stories and experiences of all the people I've met over the last 20 years who are helping me answer that question around how music is this most necessary companion in our lives, and in my case, saved my life. And so that's why I like Suleika Joad's book, the Between Two Kingdoms, because the first part is her story in the cancer ward, and then she goes on a road trip, and it's a really nice, easy quest structure, where she goes and meets others, but it's just a clever, neat way of bringing in all of those other stories. And so I'm trying to think about how I do all of that. And yeah, Carolyn, it probably will look like some kind of amalgamation of all of these different approaches, which might not be the smartest idea, but it's just the only way I kind of know how to work. I don't really work in the center of fields.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've always been trying to work between,
Yeah.
between all kinds of things. So actually, it's kind of interesting to think about, instead of thinking about what's the difference between memoir and autoethnography, how do you work between them back and forth?
Well,
Yeah,
that's where
I
I'm
like
at.
I like that idea.
That's exactly it. Yeah, that's where I'm at. I mean, your books as well. If I think about one of the first books of yours I read, Final Negotiations, that same deal, So yeah, there's that common ground, which is much more interesting, which is also, it's because I'm interested in the story rather than the particular genre.
Right.
Thanks, Carolyn. That was a good challenge for me.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Other
I can
questions?
keep on if nobody else has a question. Because you've raised so much for me, but I did want to real quickly, because I don't want to take up all the time, but we had another session. It was called something like what writing songs teaches us. And if you just go back through the program, you can get their videos. There were 4 people: David, Carlos, and Katrina, and Martin Hoiby. And they were just wonderful. The videos that they put out and all the work that they're doing about music, and they were using our book, and it's just lovely. So I just wanted to call your attention to that in case you didn't see it.
That's brilliant. I'd love to look. And David and Katrina in particular, since they were in our book, and then have done so much work recently as well. So yeah. Now I live with the songwriter, so I have no choice but to think about the parallels here. And we spend so many hours talking about his songwriting process.
And a very famous songwriter, I take it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you would love the session, and he would probably love the session too. And the videos will be accessible even after this conference.
Yeah,
please do take a look. Martin, he just got his PhD. He lives in Denmark, and his PhD was just wonderful about songwriting, and it included all the songs, and it was just fabulous.
Fantastic.
That's terrific. That's terrific. Jillian.
Hi. I had a question about working with Indigenous communities specifically. It sounds like you have a long history with that, but I recognize that, sometimes people think they want to work with a community other than their own, and they don't do the work. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about some of the maybe even challenges or successes or failures that you've had, around working with some Indigenous communities.
Thanks, Julian. It's great to hear from you, and it's a great question. Yeah, I've worked with communities for a long time, and the reason I started working with the Warramunga and Warlpiri community in Central Australia, who I've worked with for a really long time, was through an invitation. And I think so often people sort of say to me, oh, I want to work with First Nations communities. I've got this great project or idea, and I immediately start getting very uncomfortable because that is their idea that they're going to go and transplant onto a community. And we all know what's going to happen there. And so there was an invitation for us to go. And this was back in, I don't know, years ago, 2009. Is that possible? Might have even been earlier. And the next important thing was, I remember sitting down with a really important artist who in the kinship system was my sister, who's actually just passed away. So I've been thinking about her a lot. She's a fellow Noongarai, and she said, you have to come back. That we are so used to people coming here once, having a really transformative, wonderful experience for themselves, going away, and then they never come back. She said, you have to come back. There's one thing you have to do. You have to come back. And so, yeah, Sally, hit and run. Yeah, totally. There they call it the white snowstorm, comes into town and then disappears. And so through many, many years, we kept going back, and it wasn't easy. I ran out of funding. Then I had babies and, you know, sent the hubby who kept those relationships going, because it was all about relationships. And it was just that commitment to keeping up that relationship and investing in that relationship. And for me, it wasn't just relationship with people, it was relationship to country. I would go there and we would start driving down the road into the desert, and I'd look up and all the kites would be flying in the sky. And that was the ancestors greeting us to say, you're back, you've come back, and welcoming us back. And so it was connection to country as well as people. And that long-term relationship building has been so vital and key. And I think now as well, I mean, that was a long time ago. Now, when it comes to working on First Nations projects, I will only do it if it's led by a First Nations colleague. It's not my place to be leading that project for all sorts of reasons. And it needs to be governed by First Nations elders and leaders. And that's part of a commitment towards self-determination and sovereignty, and recognizing that that's the way it should be happening. And I can tell you, Julian, that has just led to the most profound, amazing relational experiences and totally and utterly different ways of doing research. When we gather and we yarn, you'd probably listen to us and go, they're very ruckus, and there's lots of music, there's lots of this and that, and relational ways of working, which is how we do business. And it's a very, very different way of operating, and been incredible to experience. So those, I guess, are some of the characteristics to answer your question around First Nations leadership, that ongoing relationship, and also that invitation, which have really characterized those sorts of connections.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great question, Jillian. Sally, yes, you're gonna be the closer for us today. You have a question for Brydie? Yeah.
Go back to Gillian. Gillian, I wondered why you asked that. I wondered why you asked that question. Yeah, if you've seen that go.
Well, I think it's a common. I think it's common no matter what community you're working with. But I've read decolonizing methodologies, and so and some of my professors are in this room that also trained me to think about these issues. So, but I think that what Brydie was saying about how long, I think what struck me is that you said you've been doing this for 20 years, and so I felt like there was some insight that you could offer, that that she could offer. So that was part of the reason why I asked about it. Yeah.
Right. Any others? I want to thank everyone for being part of this wonderful session. I know it's been a full day. Your hearts and your minds are full. Hopefully your bellies will be full next. And thank you so much, Brydie. It's just such a treat to be able to spend an hour listening about your work and just really drawing all of those important lessons together for us. It's been a masterclass in the kind of intersectional way, and how this work does such good work in the world, and is so important to everybody on the screen. Thank you all for tuning in. It's been great to be with you. Maria, I want to say that I see your message in the chat, and music autoethnographic postdoc. I've copied your email information. If I see anything that might be remotely interesting, I definitely promise to send you a notice about that if I come across anything. Yeah, great.
This
And
was
can I
wonderful.
just say, Stacy, I wanted to just say, Stacy, thank you so much as well for creating such a warm and beautiful space here this morning or this evening, and making us all feel welcome, and such lovely thoughtful questions as well. So thank you,
My
Stacy.
pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you, as always, to Tony, Carolyn, my auto ethno, and Julia too, for the invitation and for including me in this conference. It's the time is always a challenge, but it's always so good to be with you all and connected to you in this way. So thank you.
Wonderful. My heart is full right at this moment, just being in the session. So thank you all.